Mary, a young mother, enters the temple in Jerusalem, holding her infant son. She and Joseph have come to fulfill the law's requirements. Mary for her ceremonial purification after giving birth, and Jesus for his presentation as the firstborn male. It is a moment of deep faithfulness, one that countless Jewish families have lived out before them. Yet for Mary, this is no ordinary ritual. As a side note, before 1979, today's feast of the presentation of Jesus in the temple was known as the Feast of the Purification of Mary. And I confess to you, my brothers and sisters, that I am an Anglo-Catholic mama's boy. So despite the shift in focus that the church has directed, I hope you will forgive me for focusing the sermon on the Blessed Mother today, and specifically her sorrows. As Mary hands the baby Jesus to the priest, an old man, Simeon, approaches. He takes the child in his arms and proclaims words of both hope and sorrow. This child is destined for the falling and rising of many in Israel, he says, and a sword will pierce your own soul too. Mary stands before us today as the model of Christian discipleship, not as a passive recipient of God's grace, but as an active participant in God's redemptive work. Her story teaches us to trust in God's promises, to bear Christ to the world, and to remain steadfast, even in suffering. Mary was an ordinary young woman from an unremarkable town. She held no political power, no wealth, no status. Yet when the angel Gabriel appeared to her, she responded with remarkable faith. Let it be unto me according to thy word. Her presentation of Jesus in the temple is yet another act of faithfulness. She and Joseph obey the law of Moses, bringing their child to the temple. Their offering, 2 turtle doves, reveals their modest means, as this was the sacrifice prescribed for those who could not afford a lamb. This simple act reminds us that God's redemption does not depend on status or wealth. It is available to all, especially the lowly. Mary's example calls us to trust in God's promises and to live as faithful witnesses to Christ, no matter our station in life. Simeon's blessing on the infant Jesus quickly turns to a warning to Mary. A sword will pierce your own soul too. The joy of presenting her son to God is suddenly tempered with the knowledge that great suffering lies ahead. Years later, Mary will stand at the foot of the cross, watching as her son is rejected, tortured, and killed. Her suffering is woven into the fabric of God's plan of redemption. And redemption is not a painless process. It often comes through hardship and sorrow. We see this in our own lives, when we suffer loss, when justice seems far away, when the weight of the world feels unbearable. Mary shows us how to remain faithful in these moments, trusting that God is at work, even when all seems lost. And all certainly seemed lost to her when she was at the foot of the cross. Mary's presence at this moment is a testament to her unwavering trust. She does not run away in fear. She remains and stands with her son in his suffering. Nearly 5 years ago, when the pandemic hit and the world went to hell, I remember feeling such despair, especially when the beloved deacon at my former parish, Jerry Sheehan, died of COVID-19 in July 2020. It was around then that I discovered the Chaplet of the 7 Sorrows of Mary, which has its roots in the High Middle Ages. This chaplet looks like an ordinary rosary, but with 7 beads in each set instead of 10, to reflect the 7 sorrows of Mary from the Gospels. My parish began praying it together with everyone joining on YouTube on Wednesday evenings, and when we prayed the 5th mystery, I remember closing my eyes and picturing the Blessed Mother standing at the foot of the cross as she prayed to God to save their son's life as he was suffering from a torturous execution. Joining with her in her suffering didn't lessen my suffering. It often deepened it in my heart for a brief moment. But knowing that Mary's suffering was ultimately turned to joy when her son rose from the dead certainly helped bring me out of the despair I was feeling. 5 years later, the pandemic may be over, but many in our country face suffering beyond their control. Families live in fear of losing their livelihoods. Some struggle to afford basic health care. Others fear being separated from their loved ones or cast out of the communities they have called home for years. Many feel abandoned, unseen, and unheard. I was reminded of the despair I felt during the pandemic on Friday when I read the presiding bishop's announcement that the Episcopal Church must wind down Episcopal migration ministries due to the termination of federal grant funding for refugee resettlement. 22 employees had to be laid off, and over 4 decades of steadfast refugee resettlement ministry in the Episcopal Church is forced to come to an end. A sword will pierce your own soul too, Simeon said to Mary, foretelling her suffering. Mary's story speaks directly to those who are suffering. She knows what it means to be vulnerable, to live at the margins, to be displaced, to be at the mercy of evil forces beyond her control. And yet, all the while, she trusts in God with all that she is. As disciples of Jesus, we are called to do the same. We are called not only to trust God in the silence of our hearts, we are called to stand with those who suffer. Just as Mary stood at the foot of the cross, we must stand with those who are hurting. Just as she bore Christ into the world, we too must bear Christ's love, justice, and mercy to those in need. This calling is not passive. Redemption is not something we wait for. It is something in which we participate now. Just as Mary's yes to God set in motion the birth of our Savior, our yes to God sets in motion acts of justice, mercy, and love in the world. What does this look like? It looks like standing with those who are struggling, advocating for those who have no voice, and reaching out to the brokenhearted and offering them Christ's healing presence. Today, dear friends, the Blessed Virgin Mary stands before us as the model of Christian discipleship. She shows us how to trust in God's promises, to bear Christ to the world, and to stand firm in the midst of our suffering. Like Mary, will we say yes to God even when it disrupts our plans? Will we trust in God in the midst of our suffering? As Mary stood at the foot of the cross, will we stand with those who are most vulnerable among us?